Hello, hello. I'm Sarah, and today I want to talk about silence restriction, a punishment that was regularly used in the cult. Um, a lot of people don't understand what it is, so I will explain and demonstrate. Real quick before I forget, don't forget to like, comment, share, subscribe, whatever, do the things. Anyways, so silence restriction was a regular form of punishment that was used in the cult. If you were in a large community, it was pretty common to see at least one person, if not more, on silence restriction most of the time. Not always. Sometimes there'd be multiple people on silence restriction. Other homes you'd be living in and you would not find very rarely. It really depended on where you were, who was the leadership in the area, and all that. Silence restriction, you were not allowed to speak to anyone except leadership and only if you were spoken to, which was honestly a typical rule. Children were meant to be seen, not heard. So being quiet was generally preferred. I did not do the best at being quiet. I was always a bit of a chatty person. Um, I was usually really good at getting away or knowing how to slide under the radar and get away with things and not be discovered. But when I was 12, I was put on silence restriction. In my case, it was for 8 days. Um, I will specify that it was not uncommon for people to be on silence restriction for several weeks, months, or even well over a year. I've heard of many, many cases. I've witnessed many people that were on silence restriction for prolonged periods of time. Mine was 8 days. The reason I didn't have it pushed to longer was likely because I ended up getting laryngitis during that time and was unable to speak. So, yeah, I'm too chatty. I would have eventually gotten in trouble. And if you do speak when you're on silence restriction, it gets prolonged. Um, only, come here. Sorry. Dog and cat interacting. I will speak about my personal experience with it. I was 12, and to just kind of lay the groundwork of it, I there was a particular teacher that did not care for me. That's a whole other separate side story. I rarely would get in trouble, rarely get demerits. I was considered one of the good kids because I, again, flew under the radar. But during this period, I was very attracted to this young boy. We were together. He was 13, I was 12. We held hands and we stole kisses, um, and swapped notes and things like that, like 12 and 13-year-old true love is. And just a couple weeks or so into us being, together, I was placed on silence restriction. I honestly don't remember specifically what it was for, other than like the general overlay was I was oftentimes at that time of my life correcting teachers. It didn't help that Brazilians were teaching us English, and I was having a course I had already taken 3 times before. So I already knew the answers, and if teachers were incorrect, I would correct them. And apparently, I was being full of myself, and I was placed on silence restriction. And eventually, after silence restriction, I was removed from studies altogether at 12 years old. So let me just, for a hot minute, show what my silence restriction was. I will say, I real quick just made this out of cardboard, which was usually what the signs were made out of. Typically, it had a cord that you would hang it around your neck. I didn't bother doing that. I don't want to do that. And so, for the first couple of days of silence restriction, this is what it looked like, except this was almost 30 years ago, and I was 12 years old. So, 1 second. Mm-hmm. Lucky for me, the duct tape ran out. And I didn't have to wear it for very long. Not always was duct tape used. You know, spare things, not spend money on stuff. But it was used. I did see it on other people. I got very good at licking it off. I licked it off enough times that maybe they were just low on duct tape. But yeah, after a while they stopped adding the duct tape. This sign that I wore was the size of my whole chest, and it hung around my neck about here. I'm pretty sure on filming it's going to show it backwards, but what it says is, "Don't talk to me, I'm on silence restriction." I wore this around my neck for 8 days. Well, the last couple of days. During the time of being on silence restriction, I was separated from my peers. I would walk past them. I could not interact with them. I couldn't talk to them. I didn't even really want to look at them because it was very embarrassing and shameful. They wouldn't talk to me and I couldn't talk to them. At 12 years old, or any age really, I've heard studies about how horrible and challenging solitary confinement is for grown adults who go through that in prisons. Any form of solitude and being intentionally separated from your peers is very mentally traumatic. And when you're a child, and it's kind of like you literally get ghosted in your home. People don't acknowledge your presence, and you're not allowed to acknowledge theirs. It's like you suddenly become a ghost. And during that time, I was not included in studies. I didn't get to go play outside. I would get up very early with everyone else. I had to eat separately from everyone else. People might be talking about me and I wasn't allowed to respond to anything negative or positive or sympathetic. Nothing. Like nothing. I couldn't respond. I couldn't defend myself verbally or physically. Nothing. And then during the day, instead of having studies or doing anything, I was on whatever the most gross things they could think of, like scrubbing all the toilets in our large commune, on my hands and knees scrubbing floors, like all day, like a 10-hour day. On the second or third day that I was on silence restriction, I contracted laryngitis. I only know it was laryngitis because I was told that's what it was. I didn't feel sick initially, other than my throat was extraordinarily sore. And I could not speak above this very softest whisper. So that did save me from breaking my silence restriction and getting restricted to more time. I had a big lump on the side of my neck. It was rather large. It was extraordinarily sore. Swallowing, like even just drinking water, was horrible. I couldn't eat anything. I, again, could hardly drink water. This was Brazil and it was rather warm, but my neck, because it was so swollen, someone lent me a big scarf that I wrapped around to sort of act as support and to warm my neck. And I was still with this big heavy scarf around my neck, my head twisted to the side with the sign around my neck, scrubbing toilets, scrubbing the gutters, doing all the dirty, nasty work for hours. And I remember the morning, every single morning after that, I was so uncomfortable, like, because I was ill, but, my punishment wasn't going to get broken because of it. And then I still was having to do the cleaning. In the cult, you were not considered ill unless you had a fever. So the morning, every day, once I got laryngitis, I think that's what it was, I would take my temperature, hoping that I would get to a fever range. And I so wanted to fake it. Finally, I hit a fever. Barely. I honestly think I may have tapped the thermometer to the light bulb for just a minute. But I finally got a fever, and they were communities would get ravaged with illnesses. So if anyone was sick, they would typically separate you pretty quickly. And once you had a fever, you had to be fever free for 3 days before you were allowed to reintegrate in case you relapsed. So once I had a fever, I was like, yes, 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 I can finally rest, because I had my sore throat was also included a bad headache, earache. I was having severe migraines, but none of that qualified as me being ill and deserving of rest. Plus, I was on punishment. And so, while I knew me becoming sick was going to be viewed as God was punishing me and taking over in my punishment, it also meant that I was able to rest all day and not go to Bible studies and not be scrubbing everything and not be around my peers wearing this big monstrous sign. I still wasn't allowed to talk to anybody. My mom interacted with me for a bit before I ended up sick. She was allowed to have my like workout time. We played like badminton or something. And I remember her being very hurt that I was representing, being a poor representation of her. She was going through a lot of punishments herself because her health was deteriorating. This was, she at this point had brain cancer and did not know it. And so she had a lot of health problems, and those were seen as weaknesses. And so she was constantly under punishments. And now, one of her children being on punishment, they were now viewing her harsher because that meant that she was being a poor parent, which is very hypocritical because she wasn't even really raising us exactly. So, but I remember her being upset with me that I wasn't being better. And I was like, Mom, it's not my fault. Like, I know more than the teachers. Like, what am I supposed to do? I'm a well-behaved kid. I spoke out because they were teaching incorrectly. Like, they were teaching us wrong. Well, they were teaching us everything wrong. I just didn't know that part yet. But it was very frustrating because I didn't feel like I had a mom that I could confide in on what was happening. I loved my mom dearly, and but I couldn't, anything I said to her could would likely make its way to the leadership, and I would likely get longer punishment time, and she could also. There now I'm going to go off tangents on trust issues. But yeah, you couldn't trust anyone. So I couldn't like sneak a word with someone because they would get punished, and if they were going to get punished, they would rat me out so they wouldn't get punished, or they would get punished less severely. My experience with silence restriction was very minimal. It does affect me to this day. I get extremely uncomfortable if I feel like I'm being silenced or not heard, because I have been, not just for the 8 days, my whole childhood, they silenced us routinely, where we weren't allowed to express our emotions, our opinions, our thoughts, anything that was not in line with what we were taught. And so having our own free individual thoughts was not encouraged. And silence restriction was just one very obvious way that they blocked it. But our whole childhood was that way. There was an instance with Jordan, my partner. We were just roughhousing around and, being silly and wrestling about. And he put his hand over my mouth. And at first, I was just being silly and trying to pull his hand away. But as I was unable to remove his hand, when he realized it did bother me a bit, he didn't know about my past specifically with that. I didn't even realize it was something that was going to trigger me. But when I was unable to move his hand from my mouth, I started to panic, and I started like yanking. And at first I was kind of like licking at his fingers and only, sorry, big dog, very energetic. Only, baby girl, what you doing? Um, but at first I was being silly about it, like, okay, haha, get off away, but I couldn't really speak because my mouth was covered. And as I was struggling to speak and communicate what I need to say, I started becoming frantic. I started pulling and yanking at his hand away. And he thought we were still playing. He didn't realize, because again, I wasn't able to communicate to him what was happening. And I was all of a sudden in this whole panic mode, like, oh my God, I can't talk. And I like need to rip his hand away. And he let up, and I was like, don't ever do that to me. And And then I caught myself and I realized I wasn't mad at him. He didn't know. We were fooling around and he was instantly very remorseful because he didn't realize what he had done. He thought we were just being silly and I was overreacting. And from his perspective, I was overreacting. From my perspective, I was not. And so I explained to him about silence restriction, about my experience of being silenced in that way. And I didn't even realize it was something that was going to trigger me until that moment when it did. And I apologize that I got more aggressive than I meant to because he didn't deserve that. And we communicated through it. And he never did that again because he now understood. And I did too. I didn't know it was going to set off a reaction like that. I'm actually very proud of myself. I was able to have the duct tape on my face for a hot minute. I was really worried I was about to have a panic attack on film because that was likely to happen. Luckily, it did not. Yay. 29 years later. So, yeah, there are child abuses, and I laugh inappropriately. There are abuses that can have very long term effects. And as much as parents wish they could have an off button for children's mouths sometimes and the noise that they make, that was not the correct approach. And there are many, many, many other kids from the cult who experienced silence restriction in a much more intense and harsh way than I did. Honestly, I was lucky I got sick. I was very lucky I got sick. I wasn't lucky that I wasn't sick enough to have a fever for a few days. That was horrible. But when your child is thrilled to have a high fever, yeah, maybe something's really wrong. Yeah, I think that's where the video is going. I don't have more insight on that other than it was a horrible thing to experience. And I experienced one of the mildest versions of silence restriction. Oh, one other thing. At that same house, not too long after my silence restriction, one of the aunties, as we called the adults, were referred to as aunt and uncle. So one of the aunties, who was a new recruit, a new disciple, as we called them, she had joined about 5 years earlier. I remember when she was first joining. Anyways, she was put on silence restriction for I don't know what, speaking her mind, I'm sure. And she took the board and she reversed it around and she wrote on the back side of it, "Kiss my ass." And she wore that thing around her butt. And us kids were just celebrating. We were like, oh my God. No, she did it. We were so excited. And I think she walked around like that not very long, a day, maybe two, before she just was no longer there. I don't know what happened to her. I'm not implying that anything nefarious necessarily. I'm assuming she was kicked out. Sent back to her family, sent out of the cult, or maybe sent to reprogramming facility where she'd be harshly punished and study and all that hoopla. I don't know. But she was no longer at our commune very quickly after that happened. But oh my goodness, that little glimmer of rebellion and watching an adult rebel was very impactful. Um, for me, and I'm sure for a lot of us, the other young kids that were there that witnessed that. Anytime you saw someone rebel, it was a beautiful thing, and it gave us more courage to rebel ourselves, even in more quiet ways. Um, but yes, that is as close to a nutshell as I'm capable of, as I like to say. That is my experience with silence restriction. Like I said, there are people who suffered a lot worse. But yeah, that is silence restriction and my experience with it. Until next time, ciao.